What if his silence isn't a sign of strength, but a manifestation of his deepest vulnerabilities? And what if the silence you're interpreting as rejection is actually him wrestling with emotions he never learned to name, let alone share? When a man ignores you, especially without explanation, your mind instinctively fills in the blanks. Maybe you tell yourself you were too much, too emotional, too demanding. Or maybe you shrink inward, trying to become smaller, more agreeable, hoping he'll return if you just stop needing. But here's a radical truth. Silence can be a defense, not a decision. And in many cases, the act of ignoring is not a show of power. It's an escape from inner chaos. Behavior doesn't lie. And when Skinner said that behavior is shaped by its consequences, he also showed us that many people, men included, are conditioned to avoid discomfort, not confront it. Especially emotional discomfort, the kind stirred by vulnerability, intimacy, or expectations they don't know how to meet. So what happens when a man is praised for being logical, composed, and independent, but punished, shamed, or ignored whenever he reveals fear, confusion, or emotional need? He learns to disappear, not only from others, but from parts of himself. That disappearance becomes a behavioral pattern, withdrawing when conflict arises, shutting down when connection deepens, offering attention in bursts, but vanishing when feelings become too loud to ignore. You've likely felt that pattern, the intermittent presence, the warmth followed by cold. And you've probably blamed yourself for not being enough to hold his attention, not realizing that it was never about your value, but his emotional regulation. Let's be honest, women are often taught to decode silence like a mystery, to fix what feels broken, or to overfunction in the space where he pulls away. But what if you stopped seeing his silence as a message about you and started reading it as a mirror of his inner landscape? Skinner would urge us to look at the consequences that shape behavior. If ignoring you brings him relief from discomfort, and if you continue to engage, explain, or wait patiently, then his behavior is reinforced, not changed. But this isn't just about him. It's about you and the emotional residue you carry when you're met with silence. It's about the way female identity has been shaped to tolerate absence, to seek meaning in neglect, to bend in order to stay connected. This script isn't an analysis of men to fuel blame. It's an interpretation of behavior to reclaim clarity. Because once you understand what his silence may actually mean, you begin to reclaim the narrative you were never supposed to question. And in doing so, you stop waiting for a man to speak and start listening to your own emotional truth. Now let's look deeper into the psychological mechanics of male withdrawal and how it often hides a fragile illusion of control. When a man pulls away in silence, it often feels like rejection. But behind that quiet curtain, what's really happening is a behavioral strategy, one that offers the illusion of control in the face of emotional discomfort. Skinner taught us that behavior is maintained by its consequences. One of the most powerful of these is negative reinforcement, when a behavior is strengthened because it removes an aversive condition. In simple terms, if withdrawing brings relief, withdrawal becomes the default. Imagine this. He feels overwhelmed by a conversation that demands vulnerability. He doesn't know how to respond, not because he doesn't care, but because he was never taught how to sit with that emotional tension. So he escapes, doesn't call back, leaves the message on read, avoids your eyes. In that moment, his anxiety is reduced, and the brain learns silence works. Avoidance becomes soothing, but soothing isn't healing. And what brings momentary peace often leaves long-term damage, not only to the relationship but to his own emotional growth. Many men have been conditioned to regulate discomfort through avoidance. This isn't laziness or cold-heartedness, it's learned, often from childhood environments where showing emotion was punished, mocked, or simply ignored, where being strong meant staying silent, where needing someone became a source of shame, not connection. So he detaches, not just from you but from himself. And in that detachment, you're left to carry the weight. You replay conversations. You overanalyze your tone. You shrink your needs. Not because you're weak, but because your nervous system is trying to re-establish connection. You were raised most likely to mend emotional ruptures, even when you didn't cause them. The trap here is reinforcement on both sides. His silence gives him relief. Your response, patience, pursuit, or self-doubt, confirms the dynamic. You give more, he pulls back. He avoids discomfort, and you internalize it. But what if you interrupted the pattern? Skinner would point to the environment, to change behavior, change the contingencies. What if his silence no longer led to your overfunctioning? What if it was met not with explanation or pursuit, but with your own stillness, boundaries, and presence? There's another layer here. The myth that withdrawal equals power. It doesn't. It reveals a coping mechanism, one that lacks the resilience to face emotional complexity. And while it might give the appearance of composure, it often hides a deep confusion about intimacy, expectations, and the vulnerability connection requires. Avoidance might bring short-term peace, but it comes at the cost of real closeness, at the cost of trust, and for you, often at the cost of self-worth. Now let's pull the curtain further and look at the raw, unspoken vulnerability that often hides behind this silence. To the untrained eye, silence looks like strength. A man who walks away without a word, who doesn't explain, doesn't argue, doesn't show emotion, he appears calm, controlled, superior, as if he's above the drama. But this surface image, when examined closely, often conceals something far less powerful. Beneath the quiet exterior lies a fragile and often disoriented emotional world. And the silence isn't a sign of mastery, it's a symptom of avoidance. Because to express vulnerability, one must feel safe. One must have learned through consistent reinforcement that emotions don't threaten connection, they deepen it. Most men didn't learn that. Skinner's view of behavior reminds us that no response is ever random. Every reaction, or absence of one, serves a function. Silence, in this case, functions as protection. But protection from what? Start with intimacy. Real closeness is not built on words alone. It requires presence. It demands emotional exposure, to be seen not just in strength, but in fear, doubt, confusion. Many men, especially those shaped by traditional expectations of masculinity, experience this exposure as intolerable. Vulnerability triggers anxiety, not because they don't want connection, but because they associate intimacy with a kind of loss, of control, of autonomy, of identity. So they pull back, sometimes without warning, sometimes right after moments of deep connection. It's not uncommon for a woman to feel most abandoned just after a moment of closeness. Why? Because closeness activates the very fear he spent a lifetime trying to silence. If she really sees me, she'll see I'm not enough. This fear, often unspoken and unconscious, is rooted in insecurity, not arrogance. In fact, many of the men who withdraw are not overconfident, but profoundly self-doubting. The silence isn't an act of cruelty. It's a desperate attempt to escape the inner voice that says, "You're going to fail her. You're going to disappoint her. She'll leave when she knows the real you." And when that fear becomes too loud, silence becomes a refuge. Add to this the cultural conditioning, the stoic ideal of manhood that rewards control, punishes emotional expression, and ridicules dependence. A boy learns early that to cry is to be weak, that to need is to be burdensome, that to ask for comfort is to risk humiliation. So he learns not to need, or rather, not to show need. But need doesn't disappear. It hides. It festers. It shows up later, distorted, disguised, in avoidance, in sarcasm, in shutting down when things get too real, in walking out of a conversation because he doesn't want to fight, when in truth, he doesn't know how to stay. And still, beneath it all, is a desire to be loved, not for his image, but for his essence. The tragedy is, he often doesn't know how to offer that essence because he was never allowed to develop it safely. Then there's the question of autonomy. Many men, consciously or not, associate relationships with a kind of emotional captivity. The fear is not just being seen, but being consumed, that if they open up, they will be controlled, smothered, obligated. This often comes from family dynamics where closeness was manipulative or overwhelming. In these cases, distancing is not about punishment, it's about survival. He doesn't ignore you to hurt you. He ignores you to keep himself intact. But what's lost in the process is intimacy. You cannot connect with someone who won't stay in the room. You cannot build trust with someone whose silence becomes a wall you're expected to climb. And here's where Skinner's insight becomes critical. Behavior is not destiny. It's a pattern, and patterns can be unlearned, but they won't be unlearned by you waiting, begging, or explaining yourself over and over. They're only disrupted when consequences change. If his silence is rewarded by your continued presence, your emotional labor, your endless understanding, then he never has to face the discomfort that would lead to change. And you never stop bleeding from the wound of not being met. So what now? You recognize that his silence, however painful, is not about your failure. It's about his fear. You stop interpreting his absence as a verdict on your worth. You begin to ask a new kind of question. Not how do I make him respond, but why am I still trying to earn attention that should be freely given? Because behind every unanswered text, every dodged conversation, every emotionally blank stare, there is not a man who's too powerful to care, but one who's too afraid to feel. And the real question is, how long will you keep translating his fear into your unworthiness? In the next chapter, we'll turn toward you, toward the impact of this silence on your body, your mind, your sense of self. Because the emotional void he creates doesn't stay neutral. It echoes through your nervous system, and it teaches you things that were never true. Let's look at that next. There is a unique kind of pain that comes not from what was said, but from what was never said, from messages left unanswered, from conversations you rehearsed in your mind, but never had, from the subtle violence of being emotionally abandoned by someone who was physically there. When a man ignores you, not in a single moment, but through a repeated behavioral pattern, your nervous system goes into a quiet war. Not all wounds scream. Some whisper. Some bleed invisibly into your self-worth, your body, your sense of being seen. It starts subtly. You wonder if you were too much, too needy, too reactive. You replay what you said. You apologize, sometimes without knowing what for. You think, if I had stayed calm, maybe he wouldn't have shut down. You internalize his absence as evidence that you caused it. This is not just a relational response, it's a conditioned one. Women are often trained from childhood to regulate relationships through emotional labor. You were likely rewarded for being understanding, agreeable, emotionally flexible. You learned early that love often required waiting, enduring, making space for others' pain while silencing your own. So when a man ignores you, your first instinct might not be anger, it might be guilt. That guilt, left unchecked, becomes a slow erosion. You begin to mistrust your instincts. You question your boundaries. You begin to feel ashamed for having needs at all. And here's the cruel irony. The longer you stay in this dynamic, the more your own silence begins to mirror his. But yours is different. His is a strategy of avoidance. Yours becomes a symptom of self-doubt. In psychological terms, his withdrawal can trigger anxious attachment responses, a pattern rooted in early relationships where love was inconsistent. If you grew up feeling emotionally invisible, or if affection came in unpredictable bursts, then silence doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels terrifying, like being dropped into a void with no rope, no explanation, and no way to climb out. The more he retreats, the more you reach. The more you reach, the more he retreats. This dynamic is not about logic, it's about reinforcement cycles. You seek closeness not out of weakness, but because your body has learned that proximity is safety, even if it's with someone who disappears. Over time, this pattern doesn't just hurt, it redefines you. Your confidence falters, your clarity dims. You begin to second-guess not just your relationships, but your worth. And this is the emotional residue Skinner would have us examine, not just the behavior of others, but the consequences their actions have shaped in you. Because silence, when used as a behavioral weapon, whether consciously or not, teaches you to negotiate against yourself. You begin to believe that love must be earned, that peace is conditional, that your emotions are inconvenient. But the most dangerous lesson you learn is this, that absence is normal. That feeling alone, unheard, invisible, is part of being in love. And once you believe that, you'll tolerate emotional neglect, mistaking it for emotional endurance. Let's be clear. This isn't about blaming yourself. It's about breaking the trance. Because once you recognize the pattern, you can interrupt it. But first, you must see it for what it is. This is where the work of individuation begins. To reclaim your narrative, not by changing him, but by coming home to yourself. By setting boundaries not as punishment, but as an act of self-respect. by refusing to collapse inward every time someone else withdraws, because your worth is not measured by someone else's emotional availability. So, how do you hold your integrity when met with emotional neglect? How do you stop internalizing someone else's silence as your failure? Let's walk into that next, not with blame, but with power. In the next chapter, we'll explore how to transform that pain into clarity, how to stop negotiating for crumbs and instead begin living from a place of inner authority. Let's begin to reclaim your power without waiting for permission. There comes a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when something in you stops reaching, not out of anger, not even out of disappointment, but out of clarity. A clarity so deep it no longer requires explanation. It simply says, I will not abandon myself for someone who disappears. This moment doesn't arrive easily. Before it, there is often a long stretch of confusion, longing, guilt. The silent treatment from a man, especially one you've given your heart, your patience, your vulnerability, has a way of making you question your very reality. You tell yourself, if I just say it differently, maybe he'll hear me. If I'm more understanding, maybe he'll come back. And slowly, painfully, you twist yourself into shapes that were never yours, trying to fit into a silence that was never about you. But what if the very act of chasing his attention is what keeps you stuck? Behavioral psychology teaches us that reinforcement isn't just about rewards, it's about what behavior continues. Every time you excuse his absence, every time you stay available to someone emotionally unavailable, the message is delivered. This silence costs him nothing, and so it continues. Not because he's evil, but because the environment allows it. That's where your power lives, not in changing him, but in changing the consequences of how you respond. This doesn't mean you become cold or cruel. It means you become conscious. You stop negotiating your worth with someone who can't show up. You stop shrinking to maintain a connection, and you start observing without illusion what the behavior in front of you is actually telling you. One of the first acts of reclaiming your power is setting boundaries. Not as walls to punish, but as a framework to protect your energy, your truth, your emotional ecosystem. A boundary might sound like, I'm not available for one-sided conversations anymore. I'm not punishing you. I'm choosing me. This silence doesn't feel safe for me, and I honor that. These statements don't need to be spoken to him. They need to be spoken within you, because boundaries aren't about control. They're about clarity. The second act of reclaiming is cultivating self-awareness. Start noticing the sensations in your body when he pulls away. Does your chest tighten? Do you stop breathing fully? Do you immediately scan for what you did wrong? These are not flaws. These are conditioned survival strategies. The body remembers the times you were emotionally abandoned, not just in romance, but as a daughter, a friend, a woman. It remembers the ache of not being chosen, the shame of being too much, the fear of being alone. But awareness disrupts the autopilot. When you notice your patterns, you create a pause, and in that pause lives freedom. Then comes the most radical act, embracing solitude. This is not the same as isolation. Solitude is not what happens when he ignores you. Solitude is what happens when you choose to sit in your own presence, not waiting, not longing, not bargaining, but simply being. You begin to realize that your peace is not a bargaining chip. It is your birthright. And here's where Skinner's wisdom offers liberation. Just as behavior is learned, it can be unlearned. If you learn to tie your worth to others' approval, you can also learn to anchor it within. If you learn to chase silence, you can learn to stay rooted in your own voice. There's a strange power in detachment, not coldness, not indifference, but a quiet knowing that says, I see what this is, and I no longer need it to define me. Detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you stop abandoning yourself for the illusion of connection. It means you love without losing your center, and it means you let others show you who they are, without constantly explaining who you are. Because a woman who knows herself no longer waits for a man to recognize her value. She becomes the environment that refuses to reward silence. She becomes the standard by which she's treated. She becomes the voice she once waited to hear. And that voice says, I will not beg for presence, I will embody it. As we move to the final chapter, let's reflect on this journey. From pain to perception, from confusion to clarity, from waiting to choosing. Because when you stop interpreting his silence as mystery and start reading it as behavior, everything changes. You began this journey seeking to understand his silence, but what you found along the way was something far more powerful, the voice you had been silencing in yourself. What if the man who ignores you isn't in control at all, but lost in a system of conditioning that has taught him to fear the very intimacy he craves? What if his greatest weakness isn't the absence of words, but the absence of emotional tools to hold your truth and his own? We are often taught to see men as emotionally contained, detached by nature, rational and unreachable, but the truth beneath the armor is far more fragile. Many men carry a blueprint of masculinity that disconnects them from their own emotional lives, and when they reach the edge of intimacy, they fall back into the only protection they know: silence. That silence may have wounded you. It may have led you to question your worth, your instincts, your boundaries, but today let it be the mirror, not of your inadequacy, but of the emotional walls he cannot yet dismantle. You've now seen what that silence hides: fear of vulnerability, avoidance reinforced by past pain, a nervous system trained to withdraw. You've seen the patterns, and more importantly, you've seen your own response to them, and that's where the real shift begins. When you stop blaming yourself for his absence and start honoring your own presence, when you stop chasing answers in someone else's silence and start asking better questions of your own life, when you stop hoping to be chosen and start choosing you over and over again, Skinner reminds us, behavior is not who we are, it's what we've learned. And just as he learned to disappear, you may have learned to wait, to explain, to tolerate. But now you're unlearning. You are learning that silence is also a response, and sometimes your greatest healing. That being alone does not mean you are unloved. It means you are not settling. That you are not difficult. You just stopped accepting emotional scraps. This is the heart of emotional freedom, recognizing that you don't need someone to respond to you in order to validate your experience. You only need to respond to yourself, with honesty, with care, and with unwavering loyalty. So I ask you now, as Skinner might, what has been reinforced in your life that you are now ready to extinguish? And more importantly, what new behaviors, boundaries, and beliefs are you ready to reinforce in the sanctuary of your own emotional truth? If this conversation moved something in you, share your reflections below. Was there a moment that made you see his silence, or your response to it, in a new light? Subscribe for more grounded explorations into emotional resilience and female autonomy. This is not about decoding others. It's about coming home to yourself.